book. Hope you enjoyed that Clubhouse recording. Timestamp on it is 11/20/24, 5:19 p.m. CST. Thanks, everybody. Please like, share, subscribe. Big Sword. This is a Parsons book. Hope you enjoyed that Clubhouse recording. Okay, this is Jack Parsons' Freedom Two-Edged Sword audiobook. Adrian Devon. Okay, Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword, essays by John Whitsight Parsons, or a Flame #1. Edited by Cameron and Hymenaeus Beta. Introduction. Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. Okay, this book is called Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword by John Parsons. John W. Parsons was born 1914 in Pasadena. A chemical engineer and explosives expert, he was a principal scientist in the Experimental Rocket Research Group attached to the California Institute of Technology. Their testing range at Arroyo Seco in Pasadena has since grown to become the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the design and command center for the American Planetary Exploration Program. Parsons co-founded Aerojet General Corporation, now the manufacturing of the Space Shuttle's solid-fuel booster rockets in the wake of the Challenger disaster. In 1972, the International Astronomical Union named the lunar crater Parsons, 37 degrees 171 degrees west, to recognize his pivotal role in developing the solid-fuel rocket. Together with his first wife, Parsons joined the OTO in 1941 EV. He was very much the young lion of the order, where he immersed himself in the study of the occult. He briefly served as acting master of Agape Lodge, which operated from a mansion in Pasadena. A satisfactory account of his now famous Babylon working of 1946 is yet to be published. This working reset the course of Parsons' life, ending his relationship with Aleister Crowley and the OTO. Most published accounts focus on his friendship and falling out with Church of Scientology founder L. Ron Hubbard, without appraising the larger issues of what was actually being attempted and why. The present volume will hopefully serve as a foundation for a more serious study Parsons' thought, work, and influence. Jack Parsons' study of magic was not a flight from reason, neither was it escapism or any of the other excuses made for intelligent students of the occult by helpful apologists. Parsons' work was squarely in the best tradition of experimental science, that of revolutionaries such as Roger Bacon, John Dee, and Isaac Newton, who shifted the paradigm of scientific and occult thought and enlarged our world. Although Parsons died young, his thought, not yet fully matured, his intellectual promise can be clearly discerned. Parsons' essays reveal his familiarity with the literature of anthropology, psychology, and mythology. His unpublished correspondence shows him capable of simultaneously citing Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, and Aleister Crowley. He also drew on science fiction and fantasy literature, not simply for the speculative science, but for the myths, utopias, and negative utopias such literature describes. The quintessential post-war American, Parsons did not doubt the ideal world he imagined was possible. He asked the large questions and expected answers, but like the engineer that he was, he expected them to work. As a Thelemite, he wanted them to work for everyone, long before women's rights, civil rights, human rights, ecological rights, reproductive rights, or war, rights to rights, in the dark days when rights was a dirty word. He had the courage to actually do what he could and the vision to foresee much of the rest. In his surviving essays and polemical writings, much of which were written around 1950, Parsons anticipates for many years the ethical, moral, religious, and social dilemmas of the following half-century. Most of his solutions remain untried. Parsons died in 1952 in a laboratory explosion of mysterious origin. His collaborator, magical student, and second wife, Cameron, has preserved and carried on his work. These essays, many published here for the first time, survive in holograph, MS, or in the form of transcripts prepared by the Thelemic scholar Gerald J. York. Although many are fragmentary, early drafts or outlines, revision and copy editing have been kept to a minimum. Notes within brackets give additional editorial information, and unless otherwise noted, lacunae are indicated by an ellipsis. The editors wish to thank Kenneth Anger and the Warburg Institute of the University of London for their kind assistance. In the mid-1940s, Jack Parsons published an issue of the Oriflamme, a traditional OTO journal that was first issued by Theodore Roos, outer head of the OTO, some 40 years earlier. The present issue begins a new series of the Oriflamme and is respectfully dedicated to the memory of Frater Superior Merlin Peregrinus Theodore Wilson Roos. Love is the law, love and will. Hymenaeus Beta, Frater Superior, OTO, Agape Grand Lodge, New York, Autumn Equinox, 33111 or 39, something like that. I'm not sure what that is. Freedom is a two-edged sword. Preface. Since I first wrote this essay in 1946, some of my most ominous predictions have been all too grimly fulfilled. Public employees have been subjected to the ignominy and indignity of loyalty oaths and loyalty purges. Members of the United States Senate, moving under the cloak of immunity and the excuse of emergency, have made a joke of justice and a mockery of privacy. Constitutional immunity and legal procedure have been consistently violated, and that which once, not so long ago, would have been a universal outrage in America, is today refused even a review by the Supreme Court. The golden voice of Social Security has socialized this and socialized that with its attendant confiscatory taxation and intrusion on individual liberty is everywhere raised and everywhere heeded. England has entered the aegis of a regime synonymous with total regimentation. Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia have fallen victims to communism, and the United States is in the process of making deals with the barbarous and corrupt dictatorships of Argentina and Spain. As I write, the United States Senate is pursuing a burlesque investigation into the sphere of private sexual morals, which for all its buffoonery will cause pain and sorrow to many innocent persons in an intolerable and grotesque invasion of their rights. The inertia and acquiescence which allows the almost complete suspension of our liberties would once have been unthinkable. The present ignorance and indifference is appalling and almost unbelievable. That little which is worthwhile in civilization and culture is made possible by the few who are capable of creative thinking and independent action, with the grudging assistance of the rest. When the majority of men surrender their freedom, barbarism is near. When the minority surrender it, we are in the dark ages. Even the word liberalism is suspect through the unmitigated effort of fuzzy heads who believe it is synonymous with Russian bootlicking. And humanism is no more than a front for the totalism of the church. Science that was going to save the world back in H.G. Wells' time is regimented, straight-jacketed, scared, shitless. Its universal language diminished to one word: security. In this 1950 view, some of my more hopeful utterances may appear almost naive. However, I was never so naive as to believe that freedom in any sense of the word is possible to more than a few. But I have believed and do believe that these few, by self-sacrifice, by wisdom, by courage, by continuous and tremendous effort, can achieve and maintain a free world. The labor is heroic, but it can be done. By example and by education, it can be achieved. This is the faith that built America. This is the faith that America has surrendered. And this is the faith that I call on America to renew or perish. We are one nation and one world. The soul of the slums looks out of the eyes of Wall Street, and the fate of a Chinese coolie determines the destiny of America. We cannot suppress our brother's liberty without murdering ourselves. We will stand together as men for human freedom and human dignity, or we will fall together, simians, or back to the swamp. In this very late hour, it is with solutions that we must be primarily concerned. I seem to be living in a nation that simply does not know what freedom is. We believe that it is a word, a piece of paper, something we are told that we have, that we tell each other we have. Indeed, it is more, far more than that. It is to that object, to the definition of freedom, to its understanding in order that it may be obtained and defended, that this essay is devoted. I need not add that freedom is a dangerous thing, but it is hardly possible that we are all cowards. Chapter 1, A Sword is Drawn. For numberless centuries, society unquestionably accepted the proposition that certain men were created to be slaves, whose natural function was to serve priests and kings, nobles and great lords, men of substance and property that were appointed slave masters by Almighty God. Further, this system was reinforced by the established doctrines that all men and women were owned, the minds by the church, their bodies by the state. This convenient situation was supported by a considerable body of authority, morals, religion, and philosophy. Against this doctrine, some 200 years ago, was openly raised the most astonishing heresy the world has ever known, the principle of liberalism. In essence, this principle stated that all men were created equal and endowed with inalienable rights. The words inalienable rights means rights which cannot be taken away, which belong to a man as his birthright. This principle appealed to certain intractable spirits, heretics, atheists, and revolutionaries, and has since, in spite of the opposition of the majority of organized society, made some headway. As a doctrine, it has become so popular that it is rendered lip service by all major states. But it is so distasteful to persons in authority and seeking authority that it is nowhere embodied as a fundamental law and is continuously violated in letter and in spirit by every trick and expedient of bigotry and reaction. For the absolutist and totalitarian groups of the most vicious nature use liberalism as a cloak under which they move to re-establish tyrannies and extinguish the liberty of all opponents. Thus, religious groups seek to abrogate freedom of art, speech, and the press. Reactionaries move to suppress labor, and communists to establish dictatorships. All in the name of freedom. Thus, because of the peculiar distinctions given to freedom by some of these camouflaged tyrants, it seems necessary to redefine freedom in terms in which it was understood by that depraved cynic Voltaire, the dirty atheist Paine, the traitor Washington, the radical revolutionary Jefferson, and the anarchist Emerson. Freedom is a two-edged sword, of which one edge is liberty and the other responsibility, on which both edges are exceedingly sharp and which is not easily handled by casual, cowardly, or treacherous hands. For it has been sharpened by many conflicts, tempered in many fires, quenched by much blood, and although it is always ready for the use of the courageous and high-hearted, it will not remain when the spirit that forged it is gone. Now, since all tyrannies are based on dogmas, that is, on fundamental statements of absolute fact, and since all dogmas are based on lies, it behooves us first to seek for truth, and freedom will not be far away. And the truth is that we know nothing. Objectively, we know nothing at all, or any system of intellectual thought, whether it be science, logic, religion, or philosophy, is based on certain fundamental ideas, or axioms which are assumed, but which cannot be proved. This is the grave of all positivism. We assume, but we do not know, that there is a real and objective world outside our own mind. Ultimately, we do not know what we are, or what the world is. Further, if there is a real world apart from ourselves, we cannot know what that is. All we know is what we perceive it to be. All that we perceive is conveyed by our senses and interpreted by our brain. And however fine, exact, or delicate our instruments may be, they are still perceived by these senses and interpreted by that brain. However useful, spectacular, or necessary ideas and experiments may be, they still have nothing to do with absolute truth or authority. Such a thing can only exist for the individual according to his whim or fancy, or his inner perception of his own truth and being. The witches and devils of the Middle Ages were real by our own standards. All reputable and respectable persons believed in them. They were seen, their effects observed, and they perfectly accounted for a large body of otherwise inexplicable phenomena. Their existence was accepted without question by the majority of men, great and humble, and from this majority there was not and still is not any appeal. Yet we do not believe in these things today. We believe in other things similarly explaining the same phenomena. Tomorrow we will believe in still other things. We believe, but we do not know. All our deductions. For example, the theories of gravitation are based on observed statistics, on tendencies observed to occur in a certain way. But even if our observations are correct, we do not know why these things happen, or if they have always done so, or that they will continue to do so. All our theories are only assumptions, however reasonable they may seem. There is a sort of truth based on experience. We know that we feel hot or hungry or in love, but these feelings cannot by any means be conveyed to anyone who has not experienced them. We can describe them in terms of other things familiar to him. We can analyze their cause and effect according to mutually acceptable theories, but he will not have the vaguest idea of what the feeling is like. These may be very negative considerations, but within the limits we can deduce very positive principles. Number one, whatever the universe is, we are either all or part of it by virtue of our consciousness, but we do not know which. No philosophy, theory, religion, or system of thought can be absolute and infallible. They are relative only. One man's opinion is just as good as another's. There is no absolute justification for emphasizing one individual theory or way of life over another. Number four, every man has the right to his own opinion and his own way of life. There is no system of human thought which can successfully refute this thesis. That much for positivism. But other things remain that are necessity, expediency, and convenience. If these are illusions, they are still very popular illusions, and it is usual to consider them. Politics is concerned with necessity and expediency, whereas science is concerned with convenience. This is not, however, intended to discredit science and reason in their proper spheres. Reason is one of our greatest gifts, the power that differentiates us from the animals. And science is our greatest tool and our best hope for building a genuine civilization. It is curious that this modern truism appears in this system of reasoning as a concession. But in spite of its inestimable value, science is a tool. It has nothing to do with ultimate truth. Herein is the danger of science. As a tool, it is so valuable, so useful, and so irresistible that we incline to regard it as the arbiter of the absolute, giving final and irrefutable pronouncement on all things. This is exactly the position that the pedant, the dogmatist, and the dialectical materialist would have us take. Then posing as a scientist or propounding scientific doctrine, he can persuade us to accept his values and obey his orders. Today must forever be free to overthrow its yesterdays. Otherwise it will degenerate into ancestor worship. But it is necessary that we defend freedom unless we all wish to be slaves. It is expedient that we achieve brotherhood unless we desire destruction. And it is convenient that we grant others the right to their own opinions and lives in order to maintain our own. The intelligent individual will not base his conduct on an arbitrary or absolute concept of right and wrong. It may be argued that all motives and all actions are selfish, since they are intended to satisfy some requirement of the ego. Perhaps this is true of self-sacrifice, abnegation, and the highest altruism. We engage in these things in order to satisfy ourselves, to attain some object. The ego may be very broad. A man may include the whole world as a part of his ego and set out to redeem or save this world for no other reason than that he gain pleasure from this idea. Such a man, far from being unselfish, is extremely egotistical. Even the artist devoted to the production of pure beauty is so because of his need and his nature. At least such egotism is not petty. The motives of family, love, and patriotism are all rooted in biology. This does not necessarily detract from such actions and motives. Everything in nature is beautiful, and it is no less beautiful because it is understood. But the stupid man will assign arbitrary values to all things in order to protect and justify his own position. His morals are based on things which he wishes were true or which someone else wishes were true. His philosophy pays no attention to relative facts or realities, but in his life he must deal with relative facts and realities, and consequently he is constantly involved with pretenses and evasions. The enlightened liberal needs no such justification. He will realize and accept his inherent selfishness and the inherent selfishness of all men. He will understand living as technique, the technique of getting what he wants on the terms he wants. Stealing may be the most direct means of acquiring property, but unless he steals, a considerable amount of prison sentence is a possible corollary of his action. On the other hand, he may observe with dismay the subtle disintegration of character attendant upon the so-called legitimate business life. His problem, then, is not only to acquire the things he needs, but to get them in some entertaining, or at least non-devastating manner. Perhaps he will decide it is not worth the effort, but in all problems there is no question of right involved. There is only the question of technique and of cost. Such is the case with freedom. If we abrogate another's freedom to gain our ends, our own freedom is thereby jeopardized. That is the cost. If we wish to secure our own freedom, we must assure all men's freedom. That is the technique. If a liberal were to develop two personalities and one of those personalities established a benevolent dictatorship, while the other continued his liberal activities, it would be only a matter of time until he killed himself. The restriction of others' freedom is self-enslavement and suicide. The dictator is the most abject of slaves. These simple considerations are the logical basis of the philosophy of liberalism. From such considerations, and from many more, the fundamental principles of liberalism arise as a code of rights, basic in nature, clear beyond misconception. This code must be the law, and beyond the law, an ultimate expression of the dignity and inviolability of the individual. It must be above the meddlings of courts and lawyers, beyond the whim of the populace and the treachery of demagogues and dictators. It must be the epitome of men's aspirations toward liberty and self-determination, so sacred that its violation by a state, group, or individual is treason and sacrilege. The Bill of Rights in the American Constitution is a step in this direction, and its study will indicate a more final development. But in a world so threatened by positivism and paternalism, this document is limited both in scope and application. It permits such violations of liberty as the late National Prohibition Law, the Draft Law, the Closed Shop, the Mann Act, censorship laws and anti-firearm laws, and racial discrimination. It has been said with justification that the Constitution means what the Supreme Court says it means. A document so fundamental as a Bill of Rights cannot be jeopardized by arbitrary interpretations. It should need no interpretations. It must apply equally to the state and to every state, municipality, official group, and individual within the state. It must apply in such a way that the individual or minority need not recourse to elaborate, lengthy, and costly proceedings in order to protect these rights. It is the duty of the state to provide this recourse to all alike in the manner and to better purpose than life and property are now protected from the more obvious and poorly organized forms of violence. Freedom cannot be subject to arbitrary interpretation and misinterpretation. It must plainly include freedom from persecution on moral, political, economic, racial, social, or religious grounds. No man, no group, and no nation has the right to any man's individual freedom. No matter how pure the motive, how great the emergency, how high the principle, such action is nothing but tyranny. It is never justified. The question is, are we able to face the consequences of democracy? Or is it sufficient that freedom be assured by purely negative means? Freedom is meaningless where its expression is controlled by powerful groups such as the press, the radio, the motion pictures, churches, politicians, and capitalists. Freedom must be ensured, and it can only be ensured by the allegiance to the principle that man has certain inalienable rights, among which are the rights to live his private life insofar as it concerns only himself as he sees it, to eat and drink, to dress, live, and travel as, where, and how he will, to express himself as he sees fit, to speak, write, print, experiment, and otherwise create as he will, to work as he chooses, when he chooses, and where he chooses, at a reasonable and commensurate wage, to purchase his food, shelter, medical and social needs, and all other services and commodities necessary to his existence and self-expression at a reasonable and commensurate price. To a decent environment and upbringing during his childhood until he reaches a responsible majority. To love as he sees fit, where, how, and with whom he chooses, in accordance only with the desires of himself and his partner. To the positive opportunity to enjoy these rights as he sees fit, without obstruction on the one hand or compulsion on the other. To protect his person, his property, and his rights to the extent of killing the aggressor if necessary. This is the purpose of the right to keep and bear arms. These rights must be counterbalanced by certain responsibilities. The liberal accepting them must guarantee these rights to all others at all times, regardless of his personal feelings or interests. He must work to establish and protect them, live in a manner commensurate with them, and be prepared to defend them with his life. He must refuse allegiance to any state or organization which denies these rights, and aid and encourage all who, without qualification or equivocation, endorse them. He must refuse to compromise these principles on any issues, or for any reason, such as the sword of freedom. It is two-edged, a weapon for heroes. Such principles are only possible to the highest types of a civilization, and difficult enough for them. But nothing short of such principles would assure the survival of liberty, of democracy, or of society itself. Liberalism is not only a code for individuals and the state, it is the only possible basis for international civilization. Such principles, as all principles, are barren unless they are revered, and protected by those to whom they apply unless they are informed by a mature and civilized outlook. They must be interpreted and applied with understanding and sympathy, with humor and tolerance. They do not need pretentious sentimentality or hysterics in their application and defense. Insufferable bastards of high principle are sufficiently numerous as it is. Nor can we force his rights upon a man. Man has the right to be a slave if he so desires. If he does not defend his rights, he deserves slavery, and that is what he gets. The person who is tyrannized by a member of his family, or a friend, by public opinion or slave morality, is worthy of his condition, and his protestations are those of the hypocrite. Even the physically inferior person who is the subject of a bully has recourse to the equalizing effect of judo, a knife, or a gun. Any necessary means is justified if employed by the individual in defending his basic and inalienable rights. In this respect, the dueling code with the qualifications of equalizing weapons and chivalrous conduct may be the optimum solution to disputes which cannot be settled amicably. Such a system is undoubtedly less unfair and infinitely more determining than the elaborate, expensive, and ridiculous antics of contending lawyers. Furthermore, the improvement in manners would more than compensate for the deaths of a few more hot-tempered individuals who would otherwise probably perish in traffic disputes, with far more disastrous consequences to those in the immediate vicinity. This thesis is well illustrated if we consider the behavior of the cat. He will cooperate so far and no further. This is his fundamental principle. He will not be pushed around. No doubt his teeth and claws, together with his willingness to use them, contribute to the practicability of this stand. There is always one alternative to slavery. We can die fighting. No tyrant can gain more than a hollow victory against a people so committed, and even the individual can find here the ultimate rock of his inviolability. Freedom, like charity, begins at home. No man is worthy to fight in the cause of freedom unless he has conquered his internal masters. He must learn control and discipline over the disastrous passions that would lead him to folly and ruin. He must conquer inordinate vanity and anger, self-deception, fear, and inhibition. These are the crude ores of his being. He must smelt these ores in the fire of life, forge his own sword, temper it and sharpen it against the hard abrasive of experience. Only then is he fit to bear arms in the larger battle. There is no substitute for courage, and the victory is to the high-hearted. He will have nothing to do with the asceticisms or the excesses of weakness. Self-expression will be his watchword. A self-expression, tempered, keen, and strong. First he must know the rule himself. Only then can he cope with the economic pressures which are employed by economic groups and capitalists, or the political pressures employed by demagogues. He may then find himself in a difficult predicament. If he calls himself a liberal, he discovers that he is supposedly committed to the foreign policy of the Russian government. If he opposed Soviet policy, he is welcome to the camp of the Catholic Church and the Manufacturers Association. If he eschews both camps, he is condemned for lack of principle. Should he support the rights of working men or minority and racial groups, he is a red. If at the same time he believes in constitutional government and individual rights, he is also a fascist. Many liberals are familiar with this situation, but few seem to have deduced the conclusion. The difficulty exists in the stupid or deliberate confusion of the rights of the individual and the responsibilities of the state. It is a sad moment on our mentality that the social reformer subscribes to total regimentation, while the alleged individualist propagandizes for total irresponsibility. The rights of the individual can be clearly defined. His responsibilities and the responsibilities of the state can be clearly defined. His rights end where the next man's begin. It is the function of the state to ensure equal rights to all. This should be very clear, and it is amazing that this issue is so confused. In the absence of a social devotion to the principles of liberalism, positivists have usurped its name and its phrases in order to propagandize for the various totalitarianisms. This process has been greatly aided by the pseudo-liberalism, which believes that all opinion contrary to its own must be suppressed. As I write, allegedly liberal groups are agitating for the denial of public forums to those they call fascist. Americanism societies are striving for the suppression of communist or red literature and speech. Religious groups backed by a publicity-conscious press are constantly campaigning for the prohibition of art and literature, which, as if by divine prerogative, they term indecent, immoral, or dangerous. It would seem that all organizations are devoted to one common purpose, the suppression of freedom. Nor is their sincerity any excuse. History is a bloody testament that sincerity can achieve atrocities which cynicism could never conceive. Each of these groups is engaged in a frantic struggle to sell out, betray, or destroy the freedom which is their finest birthright and which alone assured their present existence. Freedom is a two-edged sword. He who believes that the absolute rightness of his belief is an authority to suppress the rights and opinions of his fellows cannot be a liberal. Liberalism cannot exist where it violates its own principles. It cannot exist when the emergency monger and utopia salesman can obtain a suspension of rights, temporary or permanent. Liberty cannot be suppressed in order to defend liberalism. The fundamental principles of liberalism must be more clearly established and defined. The rights of man are inviolable rights beyond the law, beyond the courts or the state, beyond the will of the majority or of God. If this is not understood, there can be no liberty. Freedom is not granted. It is the inalienable possession of every man, woman, and child. It cannot be taken away. It can only be surrendered. If we are to achieve a democracy, the rights of individuals and the responsibilities of states must be openly defined and ardently defended. It is inconceivable that men who have fought and died in a war against totalitarianism do not know what they fought for. It is a fantastic joke. when the things in which they believed turned like a nightmare into the things they fought against. Another generation has gone down in blood and agony to make the world safe, but the evil things that make the world unsafe still go uncowed and undefeated, plotting new sacrifices of misery and blood. Nor is the guilt entirely with warmongers, plutocrats, and demagogues. For people permit exploitation and regimentation in any name. They deserve their slavery. A tyrant does not make his tyranny possible. It is made possible by the people and not otherwise. This is a hard truth. But every liberal who does not support his principles with his utmost strength, intelligence, and courage contributes, however indirectly, to the failure of liberalism. In order to give such support, he must know and understand liberalism as a creed, a principle, and a living philosophy. By its very nature, liberalism is not a cut and dried system of thought. In ways it changes as man changes. In detail, it may vary from the individual to the individual, as those individuals vary from one another. But there are certain principles which are unchangeable. It is my purpose to explore the nature of these principles and describe a sword with which the liberal can adequately defend his liberalism. Much of our modern thought is characterized by pretenses and evasions, by appeals to ultimate authorities which are illiberal, superstitious, and reactionary. Often we are not aware of these thought processes. We accept ideas, authorities, catchphrases, and conditions without troubling to think or investigate. Yet these things may conceal terrible traps. We accept them as right because they have a surface agreement with the things in which we believe. We welcome the man who is for liberalism against communism, without troubling to inquire what else he is for or against. In our blindness, we leave ourselves open to exploitation, regimentation, and war. Tumultuous developments in science and society demand a new clarity of thought, a re-examination, and a reenactment of principles. It is not sufficient that a principle is sacred because it is time-worn. It must be examined, tried, and tested in the fires of our new needs. In our law, in our social and international relations, we are guilty of a myriad of barbarisms and superstitions. These things are tolerated simply because they exist, because we have become used to them, and because it is often unpleasant to face facts. The principle developed herein is very simple. The liberty of the individual is the foundation of civilization. No true civilization is possible without this liberty, and no state, national or international, is stable in its absence. The proper relation between this liberty on the one hand and social responsibility on the other is the balance which will assure a stable society, and by no other means short of the total annihilation of individuality can this be attained. There is no further possible evasion of nature's immemorial ultimatum: change or perish. Out of Versailles, a faint voice crying, "Time will be." Out of Paris today, the voice of trumpets proclaiming, "Time is." But tomorrow the voice of the whirlwind shouting, "Time has been." Against that time, a sword. Number 2, The Sword in the State. Okay, this is called Freedom as a Two-Edged Sword, Essays by John Woodside Parsons. This book cost me like $150. It sold for $12.95 at one point, though. So it's a pretty rare book. Looking forward to finishing it. Okay, this has been a reading, Freedom as a Two-Edged Sword, Parsons, Part 1 by Joy.
can't imagine like what someone is, like remember was that at Coca Cola where they had the noose case? They were putting the noose on his.
Do it when I'm supposed to because it's a holiday.
All's been on 2 meals a day for 75, and I eat them within like it's either like lunch and dinner, or it's like dinner and breakfast. It's never breakfast and lunch though. Like I always have dinner. But there's 14 hours a day that I'm just not eating.
Well, I didn't have that luxury when I worked at Hardee's and Carl's Jr. with my office next to the test kitchen. And then Mrs. Fields Cookies, and we had a test kitchen. It was very hard to not throw up.
When I was in college, I looked after one of the guys that founded Carl's Jr. and Hardee's, and he gave me this. I'm still so mad about it. He gave me this. I guess it's the best though in terms of not getting fat, but he gave me this thing that I could put like a key fob, like members card thing, where I got a free milkshake every single time I went to a Carl's Jr. or Hardee's. No questions asked. You just like show this.
You mean like for life? For forever?
Yeah. For it was like
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was, and a couple of like the managers when they saw that, they're like, "No way, I haven't seen one of these in a long time." Like, and it was this guy that I worked with. I never even talked to him technically because he had a stroke.
Was it? What year would this have been?
This would have been in 2000, between 2008 was my junior year of college, or no, 2009 was my junior year of college.
So was that Carl himself, Carl Karcher, or was it one of his brothers?
No. It was one of the earliest investors.
An investor, because the Karcher family had it. There were a number of them.
It wasn't in the family. It was like one of their first like big money grabs, like in terms of seed funding and everything like that.
Yeah, he almost lost the entire company in the late 80s when the real estate market in Southern California tanked. He was over-invested in it, and he almost lost the whole thing. He got dug out of it, but just by the skin of his teeth.
What's the reason that like on the West Coast is Carl's and on the East Coast is Hardee's? Generally, like sometimes you'll see.
Well, this is a little longer. I'm going to make this a very short story, but it's a long story. I worked for Hardee's first before I worked for Carl's. And our plan was to acquire Roy Rogers in the Northeast, assimilate that, and then go buy Carl's. Well, we bought Roy Rogers, and it turned out to be a complete friggin' disaster. And we lost so much money. We sold most of Roy Rogers to McDonald's. And then we were kind of hurting. And then Carl's decides to buy us. So they buy us, but they tried to do the same thing we did with Roy's. We tried to convert it. So they converted it in one of the number one markets for Hardee's, which was Champaign, Illinois. And even though they didn't change the food, the customers revolted. And so they decided that they would, half the country would be, that's not really half and half, but they would keep Carl's in the West and Hardee's in the East. And also, my business partner, my current company, is the former CEO of Hardee's and Carl's Jr.
Do you guys want to hear a good diet plan?
Sure.
Get divorced.
Well, I was just saying that with Jeff, because Jeff was like, I'm playing basketball now and going into campus, like going to the gym more often. And I lost 40 pounds when I got out of my 9-year relationship. Like, the quickest way to get in shape is to get out of a long-term relationship. Is something of.
I didn't have 40 pounds to lose, but I definitely, this has been now almost 8 years, but I got good shape, and that'll motivate.
Getting cancer will take away all